I pulled on my work gloves and headed out to check the northeast fence line, same as I did every morning after breakfast. The routine never changed: coffee, eggs, quick look at the property from the kitchen window, then grab my tools and get to work. Dad had already left for town to pick up feed, which meant I had the place to myself until afternoon. The fence posts looked solid enough, but the wire sagged in two places where deer had pushed through during the night. I pulled the stretcher from my belt and got to work, muscle memory guiding my hands through the motions. 23 years of this life had taught me that consistency mattered more than speed, and that small problems ignored became big problems fast. Our property sat 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by forest on three sides and open grazing land to the south. Most people would call it isolated, but I'd never known anything different. The Thompson family had worked this land for over a century, and we'd learned how to make it work for us. We lived by 6 rules that kept us safe out here. Dad taught them to me the same way his father had taught them to him, and his father before that. Simple rules, but absolute ones. Rule 1 meant staying on the property after sunset. Not exactly a hardship when the nearest neighbor was miles away and town required an hour-long drive on dirt roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. I'd spent plenty of evenings on the front porch, watching the trees turn black against the sky, but I'd never felt the urge to wander off into the dark. The second rule took some getting used to when I was younger. Every night at exactly 2 a.m, a woman knocked at our front door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, pause, then 3 final knocks. The pattern never changed, and neither did our response. We ignored her completely. Dad explained that acknowledgement would invite disaster, though he never told me what kind of disaster or who the woman was. I'd learned to sleep through the knocking by the time I turned 12, but on restless nights I still heard her out there, patient and persistent. I finished tightening the wire and moved on to the next section, where morning frost still clung to the metal posts. The work kept my hands busy while my mind wandered. Something Dad said was dangerous, but I'd never been able to help. Rule 3 was simple enough: never enter the old barn. The structure sat about 200 yards from the main house, leaning slightly to one side like it might collapse any day. Dad said the foundation was unstable and the whole thing could come down without warning. I'd walked past it thousands of times, but never felt tempted to go inside. Some boundaries just made sense. The 4th rule required more attention. If a man in a suit ever showed up on our property, I had to ask him to leave immediately. Didn't matter if he seemed friendly or claimed to be lost. Politeness ended at the property line. Dad had practiced this conversation with me when I was younger, making me repeat the exact words until they came automatically. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." No explanation, no discussion, just a firm request, followed by action if necessary. I reached the corner post and checked my watch. Nearly 10:30, which meant I'd finished the fence line right on schedule. The morning was turning warm, and I could already hear birds calling from the forest beyond our cleared land. Rule 5 covered the woods themselves. Never take anything from the forest that surrounded our property. Not firewood, not berries, not even a single leaf. We had everything we needed within our own boundaries, Dad said, and there was no reason to go looking for trouble elsewhere. The forest provided its own kind of fence, dense and dark enough that I'd never seen the far side of it. The last rule was the strangest one, but also the most serious, according to Dad. If I ever got lost in the woods, which shouldn't happen if I followed Rule 5, I had to stop moving and wait for the horned man. Dad's voice always changed when he talked about this rule, getting quieter and more careful. He'd never seen the horned man himself, he said, but every Thompson man needed to know what to do if the situation came up. I coiled up the wire stretcher and started walking back toward the house, mentally checking off another morning's work. The garden needed weeding, and there was a loose board on the front steps that I'd been meaning to fix for weeks. Simple tasks that kept the property running smoothly. The kind of work that made sense even when nothing else did. The rules had shaped my entire life, creating boundaries that felt as natural as breathing. I knew other people might think they were strange or old-fashioned, but those people didn't live 40 miles from nowhere with forest on 3 sides. They didn't hear knocking in the middle of the night or worry about men in suits showing up uninvited. Dad pulled into the driveway just as I reached the front yard, dust blowing up from his truck tires. He climbed out slowly, favoring his left knee the way he did on cold mornings, and started unloading feed bags from the truck bed. "Northeast fence?" he asked. "Fixed and ready for winter," I said, walking over to help with the bags. He nodded approval and lifted another bag over his shoulder. "Good. Storm coming through this weekend, according to the weather service. Better check the south line tomorrow." We worked in comfortable silence, carrying the feed to the storage shed behind the house. Dad had taught me that most conversations were unnecessary, that actions spoke louder than words ever could. The rules were the same way. They didn't need justification or explanation, just faithful following. I found comfort in these boundaries, even if I didn't understand their origins. They created a framework for living that had kept my family safe for generations, and that seemed like reason enough to respect them. Some people spent their whole lives questioning everything around them, but I'd learned that certain things were better left alone. At 23, I had never seen any reason to break them. I was halfway through replacing a rotted fence post when the rumble of a diesel engine broke the morning quiet. The sound came from the direction of the old Johnson place, which made no sense. Nobody had lived there since I was maybe 10 years old, and the house had been falling apart for longer than that. I straightened up and shaded my eyes with one hand, looking past our property line toward the overgrown driveway that cut through the trees. A moving truck was backing up to the sagging front porch of the Johnson house, its backup alarm beeping steadily in the still air. Behind it, a small car with out-of-state plates waited in the weeds. The Johnson property shared about half a mile of fence line with ours, running along the eastern edge where the forest came closest to our cleared land. I'd walked this boundary thousands of times, but I'd never seen so much as a hiker over there. The house had stood empty so long that I'd stopped thinking of it as a place where people might actually live. I pulled off my work gloves and watched 2 men in matching shirts climb out of the truck cab. They started unloading furniture and boxes with the efficiency of people who did this for a living, carrying everything up the crooked front steps and into the house. A woman got out of the car and started directing traffic, pointing toward different rooms and checking items off a clipboard. The whole scene felt wrong somehow, like watching someone set up camp in a graveyard. Dad had never told me anything specific about the Johnson place, but it had been empty my entire life for good reason. Properties didn't just sit vacant for over a decade unless something kept people away. I went back to work on the fence post, but I kept glancing over at the activity next door. The woman looked to be in her 30s with the kind of confident posture that came from making big decisions and following through on them. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt that looked new enough to still have creases from the store, and she moved around the property like she owned it, which apparently she did. The movers worked through the morning and into the afternoon, carrying in everything from furniture to what looked like gardening supplies. I finished the fence repairs and moved on to checking water lines, but the steady stream of activity kept pulling my attention away from work. By 3 o'clock, the truck was empty and pulling away, leaving just the car and the woman. I was coiling up the extra wire when she walked over to the fence line, stepping carefully through the tall grass. She moved with the deliberate care of someone not used to uneven ground, but she kept her balance well enough. "Hey there," she called out when she got close enough for normal conversation. "I'm Sarah Wilson. Looks like we're going to be neighbors." I set down the wire coil and walked over to meet her at the fence. Up close, she looked tired but determined, with dirt smudges on her shirt and grass stains on her knees. Her smile seemed real enough, though there was something fragile around the edges that suggested recent stress. "Michael Thompson," I said, pulling my work gloves back on. "Welcome to the area, I guess." "Thanks. I bought this place sight unseen, which probably wasn't the smartest move I've ever made." She laughed and gestured back toward the house. "But sometimes you need a fresh start, Somewhere quiet where you can figure things out. The house behind her looked like it needed more than figuring out. The roof sagged in the middle, and I could see gaps in the siding where weather had worked its way through. Most of the windows were intact, but the front porch leaned at an angle that made me nervous just looking at it. "It's going to need some work," I said. "That's an understatement." Sarah kicked at a clump of weeds near the fence post. "But I'm divorced now, and I needed somewhere I could afford. This place was cheap enough that I could buy it outright with my half of the settlement." I nodded, like that made sense, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would choose to live out here without understanding what they were getting into. The isolation that felt natural to me would probably feel oppressive to someone used to city life, and that was before considering the other complications. "How long since anyone lived here?" she asked. "At least 15 years, maybe longer." I watched her face for any sign that she'd done research about the property, but she just looked curious. "The Johnsons left when I was young. House has been empty ever since." "Well, it won't be empty anymore." Sarah brushed dirt off her hands and looked back toward the house with the kind of determination that suggested she'd already made up her mind about something. "I've got a generator for power and a well for water. Figure I can make it livable while I decide what comes next." The practical part of me wanted to tell her about the roof and the foundation problems I could see from here. The part of me that had been raised on 6 unbreakable rules wanted to warn her about much more serious concerns. But Dad had also taught me that some conversations were better avoided, especially with outsiders. "You'll want to keep your doors locked at night," I said finally, "and maybe avoid wandering around the property after dark. We get all kinds of wildlife out here." Sarah laughed, and the sound carried an edge of defiance that made me think she'd heard plenty of warnings from other people recently. "I'm not afraid of the dark or some raccoons. I grew up camping with my family. It's not just raccoons." I tried to find words that would convey seriousness without getting into details I couldn't explain. "This area can be unpredictable at night. Better to stay inside once the sun goes down." "Are you talking about bears? Coyotes?" Her tone suggested she thought I was being overly cautious, maybe even condescending. "I appreciate the concern, but I can take care of myself." I could see that pushing the point would only make her more determined to prove me wrong. Some people responded to warnings by being extra careful, but others took them as challenges. Sarah looked like the second type. "Just something to keep in mind," I said, stepping back from the fence. "I will. Thanks for being neighborly." She glanced at the tools scattered around my feet. "Looks like you stay busy around here. Always something that needs fixing." I picked up the wire coil and slung it over my shoulder. "If you need anything, our house is about a quarter-mile that way through the trees, but you probably won't see much of us. We keep to ourselves mostly." "That's fine by me. Privacy was one of the things I was looking for." Sarah started walking back toward her house, then turned around. "It was nice meeting you, Michael. Thanks for the welcome." I watched her navigate the uneven ground back to her property, noting how she avoided the worst of the holes and obstacles without really thinking about it. She moved like someone who adapted quickly to new situations, which was either going to serve her well out here or get her into serious trouble. Dad's truck pulled into our driveway just as Sarah disappeared inside her house, and I could see him through the windshield looking toward the Johnson place with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. He climbed out slowly and stood next to his truck for a long moment, studying the car parked in the overgrown driveway. "Someone bought the Johnson place," I said when I reached the house. "I can see that." Dad's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality he used when he was thinking through implications. "When did they move in?" "Today. Moving truck left about an hour ago." I set my tools down on the front steps and pulled off my work gloves. "Woman named Sarah Wilson. Says she bought it sight unseen after a divorce." Dad's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was processing information he didn't like. What did you tell her? Told her to keep her doors locked and stay inside after dark. She didn't seem too concerned about it. People never are. Dad walked over to the fence line and looked across at the Johnson house, where lights were starting to come on in several windows. Did she say anything about why she picked this particular place? Wanted somewhere quiet and cheap, somewhere she could start over. I joined him at the fence, watching Sarah move around inside the house. She doesn't know anything about the area. Bought it without even visiting first. Dad was quiet for a long time, and I could almost hear him working through the same concerns that had been bugging me all afternoon. The rules that governed our property had been designed for a family living in isolation, surrounded by empty forest. Adding a neighbor changed things in ways I didn't fully understand. We'll need to keep an eye on things, he said finally. Make sure the boundaries stay clear. I knew he meant more than just the fence line between our properties, but I didn't ask for clarification. Some things were better left unspoken, especially when we didn't know yet how much trouble we might be facing. We went inside for dinner, but I found myself looking out the kitchen window toward the lights in Sarah's house. She had every room lit up like she was trying to push back the darkness, which meant she was nervous about something even if she wouldn't admit it. That was probably smart, even if she didn't understand why. The evening passed quietly enough. I read for a while after dinner, and Dad worked on paperwork at the kitchen table. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed that most of the lights in Sarah's house had gone out, leaving just one bright window that I figured was her bedroom. I went to bed at my usual time, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound outside seemed louder, and I found myself listening for things that shouldn't be there. At 1:30, I heard the first knock. That was 30 minutes earlier than usual. The woman always came at exactly 2 in the morning, had done so for as long as I could remember. But tonight the knocking started at 1:30, and the rhythm was different too. Instead of the patient, measured pattern I was used to, these knocks came faster and with more force. Urgent, almost aggressive. I got up and looked out my bedroom window toward Sarah's house. Every light was back on, and I could see a figure moving around inside. Probably Sarah herself, wondering what the hell was making all that noise. The knocking continued for several minutes, much longer than usual, before finally stopping. But even after the silence returned, the lights in Sarah's house stayed on. I stood at my window for a long time, watching those lit windows and thinking about the careful balance Dad had mentioned. Our family had maintained something out here for generations, some kind of understanding that kept us safe as long as we followed the rules. But what happened when someone who didn't know the rules moved in next door? The lights in Sarah's house were still burning when I finally went back to bed, and I had a feeling they'd stay on until morning. I was checking the water trough behind the house when I spotted Sarah walking toward the fence line. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong with her. Her usual confident walk had been replaced by careful, hesitant steps, and she kept looking over her shoulder like she expected to see someone following her. The bags under her eyes were visible even at 50 yards. Her hair looked like she'd run her hands through it repeatedly, and her clothes were the same ones she'd worn yesterday, now wrinkled like she'd slept in them. Or maybe hadn't slept at all. I put down the hose and walked over to meet her at the fence, noting how she stopped a few feet back from the posts instead of stepping right up to them. Her hands shook slightly as she crossed her arms over her chest. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the knot forming in my stomach. "Hi." Sarah's voice came out hoarse, like she'd been talking or shouting for hours. "I was wondering if you heard anything strange last night. Like knocking sounds?" The question hung in the air between us. I could see the hope in her tired eyes, the desperate need for someone to confirm that she hadn't imagined whatever had kept her awake. But admitting I'd heard the woman would mean explaining things I couldn't explain, breaking rules that existed for good reason. "Old houses make all kinds of weird noises," I said instead. "Settling foundations, wind in the eaves, animals on the roof. You'll probably get used to it after a few nights." Sarah's face fell slightly, and I felt like a bastard for dismissing her concerns. But some conversations were too dangerous to have, especially with someone who didn't understand what they'd gotten themselves into. It wasn't that kind of noise. She rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand. It was definitely knocking. Someone knocking on my door for hours. Started around midnight and didn't stop until dawn. My mouth went dry. The woman usually knocked for maybe 5 minutes at most. But last night had been different. The rhythm had been wrong, the timing off, and apparently the duration too. Sarah's presence was already changing things in ways I didn't understand. "Did you look outside?" I asked. "See who it was?" I tried, but I couldn't see anyone from the windows. The knocking was definitely coming from the front door, though. Sarah glanced back toward her house. And then just before sunrise, I saw a man in a suit walking around my property. Dark suit, perfectly dressed like he was heading to some business meeting. Who wears a suit at dawn in the middle of nowhere? The worry in my stomach got worse and turned into panic. The man in the suit had never left our property before, never crossed the boundary lines that had kept him in place for generations. If he was walking around Sarah's land, it meant the rules were breaking down faster than I'd thought possible. "You need to tell anyone like that to leave immediately," I said, probably too forcefully. "Don't let him in the house. Don't talk to him. Just ask him to go and call the sheriff if he refuses." Sarah's eyebrows went up. The sheriff? For a guy in a suit? I realized how paranoid I must sound, warning about a well-dressed stranger like he was an escaped convict. But explaining the real reason would sound even crazier. And Sarah was already looking at me like I might not be entirely stable. "People get lost out here sometimes," I said, scrambling for something that sounded reasonable. "Usually they're harmless, but you can't be too careful living alone. I suppose that makes sense." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway, though he didn't seem lost, more like he was inspecting things, looking around like he owned the place. That description sent a chill through me. The man in the suit had always been polite but predatory, contained but testing boundaries. If he was walking Sarah's property like he owned it, we might already be too late to fix whatever was happening. The morning passed slowly after that conversation. I tried to focus on routine work, but my attention kept drifting towards Sarah's house. I could see her moving around inside, occasionally appearing at different windows like she was checking for unwanted visitors. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard the generator that had been making noise steadily since yesterday's sputter and die. The sudden silence felt scary, like the first sign that Sarah's urban solutions weren't going to work out here. A few minutes later, she came out of the house and walked back toward the fence line. "Hey, Michael," she called out. "I hate to bother you again, but my generator just died on me. Do you have any tools I could borrow to take a look at it? Maybe something in that barn of yours?" The request caught me completely off guard. The barn was absolutely off limits, Rule 3 written in stone for reasons I didn't fully understand but had never questioned. Even suggesting that someone else might enter it felt wrong, like breaking a fundamental law of physics. "I can bring you whatever you need," I said quickly. "The barn's not safe to go into. Foundation problems, like I mentioned before." Sarah looked unhappy. "I just need basic tools, a wrench, maybe some pliers. It would be easier if I could just grab them myself." "Really, it's no trouble." I was already backing away from the fence, ready to collect whatever she needed from the tool shed. "What exactly are you trying to fix?" "The fuel line looks clogged, and I think there might be a loose connection somewhere." Sarah's frustration was obvious in her voice. "I can handle basic mechanical work, but I need the right tools. I'll get you a wrench set and some pliers. Give me 5 minutes." That was when Dad appeared around the corner of the house, moving with the careful walk that meant he'd been listening to our conversation. His eyes found mine immediately, and the look he gave me could have frozen water. The message was clear. We were discussing things that weren't our concern with someone who wasn't our responsibility. Problems with the generator?" Dad asked Sarah, his tone polite but distant. "Nothing I can't handle once I get the right tools," Sarah replied, though I could hear the defensive edge creeping into her voice. "Michael will bring you what you need." Dad's words were directed at her, but his eyes stayed on me. "Our property has everything required for basic repairs." The emphasis on our property wasn't subtle, and Sarah caught it immediately. I watched her face change as she realized she was being politely but firmly excluded from something, though she probably didn't understand what. "Right," she said slowly. "Well, I'll just wait over here then." Dad nodded and walked toward the house, leaving me standing at the fence with Sarah looking confused and slightly hurt. The moment stretched uncomfortably as I tried to think of something to say that would smooth over the obvious tension. "He's not unfriendly," I said finally. "Just private. We don't get many neighbors out here." "I'm getting that impression." Sarah's voice had cooled noticeably. "Maybe I should just drive to town for tools instead. I don't want to be a bother." "It's no bother, really." But even as I said it, I could see that the damage was done. Sarah was starting to put pieces together, recognizing that her new neighbors were hiding something and didn't want her getting too close to whatever it was. I gathered the tools she needed from our shed and carried them back to the fence. Sarah accepted them with a brief thanks, but the warmth from our earlier conversations was gone. She seemed eager to get back to her house and away from whatever weirdness the Thompson family was giving off. "I'll bring these back when I'm done," she said. "Take your time." Sarah walked back toward her house with the tools, but I noticed she didn't turn around to wave or call out another thanks. The easy friendliness of yesterday had been replaced by careful distance, and I couldn't blame her for it. From her perspective, we probably looked like unfriendly neighbors who made scary warnings about strangers and refused to let her borrow tools from our barn. She had no way of knowing that our behavior was designed to protect her, or that the boundaries we maintained weren't just social preferences but literal survival mechanisms. All she could see was that the Thompson family was keeping secrets and didn't trust her enough to be straight with her about anything. I watched her disappear into her house and felt all the things I couldn't explain pressing down on me. Dad was right about maintaining boundaries, but those boundaries were making Sarah suspicious and isolated. And suspicious, isolated people had a tendency to start asking questions and testing limits, which was exactly what we couldn't afford right now. The generator came back to life around 4 o'clock, and Sarah's house filled with lights again. But the easy neighborliness of yesterday was gone, replaced by careful distance and growing mistrust. She thought we were unfriendly or hiding something. She was right about the hiding part, at least. The third night changed everything. I'd gone to bed around 10:30, same as always, but sleep wouldn't come. Something felt different in the air, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. I lay there listening to the house settle around me, waiting for something I couldn't name. When the knocking started at midnight, I knew immediately that this wasn't the woman we'd grown used to. The sound hit our front door like a sledgehammer. 3 thunderous blows that shook the windows in their frames, followed by a pause barely long enough to draw a breath, then 3 more that rattled the dishes in the kitchen cabinets. The third set came with such force that I heard something crack in the door frame. I sat up in bed. In 23 years, the woman had never knocked like this. Her usual rhythm was patient, persistent, but controlled. This was rage given sound, desperation made physical. The pattern repeated every few seconds, each round more violent than the last. By the 4th or 5th cycle, I could hear wood splintering around the door hinges. Whatever was out there wasn't just knocking anymore. It was trying to break down our front door. I pulled on jeans and a shirt, then crept down the hallway toward the kitchen. Dad's bedroom door stood open, his bed empty. Light spilled from the kitchen doorway, and I could hear the soft scrape of a chair being moved. When I stepped into the kitchen, I found Dad sitting at the table with his back to the wall, facing the front door. A double-barreled shotgun lay across his knees, both hammers cocked. His weathered hands gripped the stock with white knuckles, and his eyes never left the direction of the knocking. I'd never seen him with that gun before. I'd known it existed somewhere in the house, but in over 2 decades of living here, through all the years of following the rules and ignoring the woman's nightly visits, he'd never felt the need to arm himself. "Dad?" I kept my voice low, though I doubted anything could be heard over the relentless pounding at our door. "Sit down," he said without looking at me. "Stay away from the windows." I took the chair across from him, watching his jaw muscles work as each round of knocking shook the house. The violence of it was unlike anything I'd experienced. Our windows rattled in their frames, and I could hear items moving on shelves throughout the house. "Why is it different tonight?" I asked. "Newcomers sometimes disrupt the balance." Dad's voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Makes them more aggressive until they establish new territorial boundaries. The knocking stopped for maybe 10 seconds, long enough for me to hope it was over. Then it started again with twice the previous intensity. The front door made noise under the assault, and I heard the distinct sound of wood beginning to fail. What if the door breaks? It won't. But Dad's grip on the shotgun tightened as he said it. It's held for over 100 years. It'll hold tonight. We sat in tense silence after that, listening to the systematic destruction being visited on our front entrance. The knocking continued without pause or variation in intensity, a mechanical rhythm that suggested whoever was out there could maintain this assault indefinitely. Around 1:30, a new sound joined the chaos, knocking from the direction of Sarah's house. But this wasn't the measured pattern we'd grown used to. This was frantic, desperate pounding that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several people were attacking her house simultaneously. Dad's face went hard when the second round of knocking started. He stood up slowly, still holding the shotgun, and moved to the kitchen window that faced Sarah's property. I followed, careful to stay out of direct line of sight from outside. Every light in Sarah's house blazed against the darkness. Through her windows, I could see movement, furniture being overturned, items flying through the air as if thrown by invisible hands. The knocking at her house grew louder and more chaotic, broken up by the sound of breaking glass. "We have to help her," I said. "No." Dad's response was immediate and final. "We stay here. We follow the rules." "She doesn't know the rules. She doesn't understand what's happening." "That's not our responsibility." The coldness in his voice shocked me. I'd seen him be distant with outsiders before, but this was different. This was deliberate abandonment of someone who was suffering because she'd had the misfortune to move in next door to us. Around 3 a.m, Sarah started screaming. The sound cut through the chaos of breaking wood and shattering glass. It was raw terror given voice, the kind of scream that came from someone facing something their mind couldn't process. The sound went on, rising and falling in waves that suggested she was running from room to room, trying to escape whatever was chasing her. I stood up from my chair, every instinct telling me to run to her aid. "Dad, please. We can't just sit here while she—" "We don't break the rules." His voice carried absolute authority, the tone he'd used when I was young and testing boundaries. "Not for anyone. Not for any reason. But she's innocent. She doesn't know what she got herself into. Innocent people die all the time when they make bad choices." Dad's eyes never left the window facing Sarah's house. "Our job is to protect our family and maintain the boundaries that keep us safe. Nothing else matters." Sarah's screaming continued for another 20 minutes, sometimes fading to quiet sounds, sometimes rising to shrieks that made my skin crawl. Every cry for help hit hard, and I found myself holding the edge of the table so tight my knuckles went white. Then, just before 4 a.m, the screaming stopped. The knocking at both houses continued for another 3 hours, but the human sounds from Sarah's property went quiet. No more cries for help, no more sounds of running footsteps, just the mechanical assault on our doors and the steady destruction of everything she owned. When dawn finally came, both rounds of knocking stopped suddenly. The sudden silence felt overwhelming after hours of chaos, like the moment after a thunderclap, when your ears ring with the absence of sound. Dad uncocked the shotgun and leaned it against the wall, then walked to the kitchen window. I joined him, looking across at Sarah's house in the growing daylight. Every window that had been whole the night before was now broken. The front door hung at an angle, supported by only the bottom hinge. Furniture and belongings were scattered across the front yard as if the house had exploded from the inside out. But there was no movement anywhere. No sign of Sarah. "We need to check on her," I said. "We need to assess the damage to our own property." Dad turned away from the window. "Then we'll decide what comes next." I spent the morning walking our fence line, checking for breaks or signs that whatever had attacked the houses had also tested our boundaries. Everything looked fine, but it felt wrong after the chaos of the night. Around noon, I still hadn't seen any movement from Sarah's house. No attempt to clean up the mess. No sign that she was even alive over there. The quiet from her property was becoming as scary as the violence had been. Dad spent the morning on the phone with someone, speaking in low voices that I couldn't make out from the kitchen. When he hung up around 1 o'clock, his expression was worse than I'd ever seen it. "What's happening over there isn't our problem," he said when he saw me looking toward Sarah's house. "Our job is to maintain our own boundaries and protect our own family. What if she's hurt? What if she needs help? Then she'll figure out how to get it herself, or she won't." His tone suggested the conversation was over. Either way, it's not our responsibility. But I couldn't stop thinking about those screams, about the terror in Sarah's voice when whatever had invaded her house finally caught up with her. The woman who'd moved in 3 days ago with boxes of new belongings and plans for a fresh start deserved better than being left alone to face something she couldn't understand. At 2 o'clock, I made a decision that went against everything I'd been taught. I waited until Dad went into his bedroom for his afternoon rest. Then I walked across our property toward the barn. The old building leaned at its usual angle, looking exactly as it had for the past decade. But today, for the first time in my life, I was going to find out what Rule 3 was really protecting. The door stuck when I tried to open it, warped wood catching on the frame. I had to put my shoulder into it to get it moving, and it opened with a groan that sounded loud enough to wake the dead. Sunlight came through gaps in the roof, lighting up dust that danced in the still air. The inside smelled of old hay and decades of being ignored, but the building was far more solid than it looked from outside. The foundation was perfectly sound, the support beams straight and strong. Dad had lied about the problems with the building. I moved deeper into the barn, stepping carefully over loose boards and rusted farm equipment. In the back corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old feed sacks, I found what I was looking for: coiled rope, emergency supplies, and a metal toolbox that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. But it was what I found next to the supplies that changed everything. A wooden crate sat tucked behind the feed sacks, filled with leather-bound journals. The books were old, some dating back more than a century based on the dates written on their covers. Names were written on the front of each journal. Thompson men going back generations. I picked up the oldest one I could find, dated 1847, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was faded but still readable, written in the careful script of someone who'd had formal education. The agreement was struck this day with the entities that dwell beyond the forest line. In exchange for their confinement to the lands bounded by creek, ridge, and stone markers, our family pledges to serve as guardians and maintain the barriers that prevent their expansion into the wider world. I flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of encounters with beings that sounded exactly like the woman who knocked and the man in the suit. But these weren't random supernatural threats that had stumbled onto our property. They were prisoners. The journal from 1889 was even more clear. Father explained today that we are not protected by the rules. We are bound by them. These things were here first, driven from their original territories by settlers who feared what they did not understand. Our ancestor made a bargain. Safe containment for them, guaranteed guardianship from us. Break the agreement, and they are free to reclaim what was taken from them. I sat heavily on an overturned feed bucket, my mind racing to process what I was reading. Everything I'd believed about our family's role here was wrong. We weren't just following rules that kept us safe from random supernatural threats. We were jailers, bound by a contract that stretched back over a century. The woman who knocked, the man in the suit, the horned man who appeared when Thompson men got lost, they weren't our enemies. They were prisoners we'd been keeping contained through ritual and tradition, and Sarah's presence had apparently begun to weaken the barriers that held them. A journal from the 1920s confirmed my growing dread. The boundaries are weaker when outsiders settle nearby. Their lack of knowledge about the agreement creates gaps that these things will test. We have to stay alert to maintain the containment, sometimes at great cost to those who do not understand what they have stumbled into. I closed the journal and looked around the barn with new understanding. This wasn't just storage space Dad had kept me away from. This was our family's archive, the record of over a century of guardianship that had been hidden from me until I was old enough or desperate enough to break the rules and find it myself. The knocking woman, the man in the suit, they weren't trying to hurt us. They were testing the boundaries of their prison, looking for weaknesses they could use to expand their territory. And Sarah, with her lack of knowledge about the rules and her refusal to follow the warnings we'd tried to give her, had provided exactly the kind of weakness they needed. We weren't just neighbors who followed strange traditions. We were guardians keeping supernatural prisoners contained, and Sarah's presence had given them their first real chance at freedom in over 100 years. I shoved the journal back into the crate and stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The weight of what I'd learned pressed down on my shoulders. My hands shook as I pushed through the barn door and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. The familiar landscape looked different now, charged with meaning I'd never understood. Every fence post, every boundary marker, every carefully maintained border between our property and the forest beyond wasn't just practical organization. These were the walls of a cage, and the things inside were testing their strength. I walked toward Sarah's house with purpose that surprised me. Dad would be furious when he discovered what I was about to do, but I couldn't abandon her to face something she had no context for understanding. The journals had made one thing clear. Ignorance didn't protect anyone from the consequences of breaking supernatural agreements. The closer I got to her property, the more wrong everything felt. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Birds had gone silent in the trees around her house, and even the usual afternoon breeze had died to nothing. It was like approaching the eye of a storm that hadn't broken yet. Sarah's front door hung open at an impossible angle, the top hinge completely torn away from the frame. Glass covered her front porch from the broken windows, and her belongings were scattered across the yard like debris from an explosion. But there was a deliberate quality to the destruction that suggested intention rather than random violence. I stepped carefully through the wreckage and called out her name, though I got no response. The silence from inside the house was complete, but not empty. Something was moving in there, creating small sounds that didn't quite register as footsteps or voices. When I crossed the doorway into her kitchen, I found Sarah. She lay unconscious on the linoleum floor, surrounded by overturned chairs and broken dishes. A thin line of blood traced from her temple down to her jaw, but she was breathing steadily. More disturbing than her condition were the marks carved into the wooden walls around her, symbols that looked like a combination of letters and geometric shapes, cut deep enough into the wood that they'd probably be permanent. I knelt beside her and checked her pulse, which was strong but slow. Whatever had happened here, she was alive but completely unresponsive to my voice or touch. Her skin felt cold despite the warm afternoon, and when I lifted her eyelid to check her pupils, her eyes had rolled back to show only white. That was when I heard the voice from the living room. She signed herself over quite willingly once we explained the situation properly. The voice was polite, exactly the tone I remembered from childhood warnings about men in suits. But underneath the courtesy was something predatory that made every survival instinct I possessed start screaming warnings. I stood slowly and moved toward the doorway between the kitchen and living room, each step feeling like walking deeper into a trap I couldn't avoid. When I found him, he was standing beside Sarah's overturned couch with his hands clasped behind his back, like he was touring an art gallery. The man in the suit looked exactly as Dad had described him over the years. Perfectly dressed, unnaturally clean, with features that were almost but not quite right. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright, and when he moved it was with mechanical precision that no human being could maintain. "You must be young Thompson," he said without looking at me. "Your family's reputation precedes you, though I must say your timing could be better. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." The words came out automatically, exactly as Dad had drilled them into me since childhood. Rule 4 was absolute. Any man in a suit had to be asked to leave immediately, no matter how polite or reasonable he seemed. But instead of the compliance I'd been taught to expect, the man in the suit turned to face me with that unnaturally wide smile growing even broader. "I'm afraid that's no longer how this works," he said. "The young lady has invalidated your family's territorial claims through her ignorance. This property now falls under our jurisdiction. That's not how the rules work. The rules were a contract, Mr. Thompson, and contracts can be broken." He gestured toward the carved symbols on Sarah's walls. "Your neighbor has provided us with new legal standing. We no longer require your family's permission to expand our influence." The sound of systematic destruction came from upstairs. Furniture being overturned, glass breaking, wood splintering. But the rhythm was too regular, too methodical to be random vandalism. Someone was working their way through every room in a deliberate pattern. "What did you do to her?" I nodded toward the kitchen where Sarah lay unconscious. "We offered her a choice. Join us willingly, or resist and face the consequences." The man in the suit smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his jacket. "She chose resistance initially, but came around to our perspective after we demonstrated the futility of that position." My stomach turned as I realized what that meant. They'd broken her somehow, worn down her resistance until she'd agreed to whatever they wanted. The symbols on her walls weren't just supernatural graffiti. They were some kind of contract she'd been forced to sign. The methodical destruction upstairs stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of measured footsteps coming down the stairs. Each step hit the wooden treads with identical force and timing, like a metronome made flesh. When the knocking woman appeared at the bottom of the staircase, I understood why the sound had been so mechanical. She moved with the same unnatural precision as the man in the suit, but where he maintained a veneer of human appearance, she made no such effort. Her arms were too long for her body, ending in fingers that looked more like wooden dowels than human digits. Her face was a pale blur with dark holes where eyes should be, and when she walked, her feet made no sound despite the heavy rhythm I'd heard from upstairs. "The upper rooms are prepared," she said to the man in the suit, her voice carrying the same patient cadence as her nightly knocking. "The boundary markers have been installed." "Excellent." The man in the suit clasped his hands behind his back again. "Mr. Thompson, you should know that your neighbor's property now serves as our primary expansion point. We'll be moving beyond these boundaries within the week." The casual way he announced the end of everything my family had worked to prevent for over a century made my blood run cold. If they spread beyond the contained area, If they moved into the wider world where people had no understanding of what they were dealing with, the consequences would be catastrophic. The agreement stands, I said, though my voice sounded thin and desperate even to my own ears. Your territory is contained by the original boundaries. The agreement was with your family specifically, contingent on your successful maintenance of the containment perimeter. The man in the suit examined his fingernails with apparent fascination. Your failure to prevent unauthorized settlement constitutes breach of contract. That was when the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. The change was so sudden that my breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the inside of Sarah's broken windows. Both the man in the suit and the knocking woman went completely still, their unnaturally precise movements freezing mid-gesture, like someone had paused a film. When the horned man stepped through Sarah's front doorway, I finally understood what Rule 6 had really been preparing me for. He was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with antlers that branched and twisted like very old oak limbs. His skin had the texture of weathered bark, deep brown with furrows that moved and changed as he walked. But it was his eyes that held me frozen in place. They glowed with soft amber light that seemed to see straight through everything I thought I knew about the world. "The boy calls upon the old law," the horned man said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The compact remains in force until properly dissolved." For the first time since I'd encountered them, both the man in the suit and the knocking woman showed something that might have been uncertainty. They moved back from the horned man with careful, measured steps that suggested respect tinged with fear. "The containment was broken," the man in the suit said, though his earlier confidence had evaporated. "The Thompson boy failed to maintain the boundaries." "The Thompson boy was not informed of his true responsibilities," the horned man replied. "Ignorance on both sides does not void binding agreements made in good faith." I stood there trying to process what was happening while frost continued to spread across every surface in the room. The horned man's presence was overwhelming, not threatening exactly, but so fundamentally other that my brain struggled to categorize what I was experiencing. "The young woman's presence has disrupted the balance," the horned man continued, turning those glowing eyes toward me. "But disruption is not dissolution. New terms must be negotiated, or the original compact will reassert itself with consequences none of us desire." The man in the suit's perfect composure finally cracked. "The human settlements have moved beyond the original boundaries. Our needs have grown with time. Containment is no longer enough. Then we will discuss expansion within the framework of the existing agreement." The horned man's voice carried absolute authority. "Or you will return to your designated territories and await formal renegotiation." I realized with stunning clarity that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not me getting lost in the forest and needing rescue, but me being lost in a situation where the old rules no longer worked and new ones had to be created. The horned man wasn't just some supernatural emergency service for Thompson men in trouble. He was the mediator who kept the balance between worlds. "The original agreement stands until new terms are reached," the horned man said, looking directly at me. "But the boy must understand what he has inherited, and the young woman must choose whether to accept responsibility for what her ignorance has begun." Sarah's unconscious form stirred slightly on the kitchen floor, and I realized that everything, her safety, my family's century-long guardianship, the containment of entities that could devastate the outside world, now depended on negotiations I'd never been prepared to conduct. The frost spreading across Sarah's broken windows caught the afternoon light and scattered it into dozens of tiny rainbows. I tried to focus on that small beauty instead of the overwhelming presence of the horned man, but his amber eyes seemed to pull my attention back like gravity. "The negotiation begins with understanding," the horned man said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "Young Thompson, what have you learned about your family's true role here?" I glanced at the man in the suit and the knocking woman, both standing motionless near Sarah's overturned furniture. Their earlier confidence had vanished completely, replaced by something that looked like children waiting to be scolded by a parent. "We're guardians," I said, though the word felt strange in my mouth now that I understood what it really meant. "But not protecting ourselves from you, protecting everyone else from the consequences of what our ancestors agreed to." "And what was that agreement?" Sarah stirred on the kitchen floor behind me, letting out a soft groan that made my chest tighten with relief. She was waking up, which meant whatever they'd done to force her compliance hadn't caused permanent damage. "Containment," I continued, keeping my eyes on the horned man. "Your people were driven out of their original territories, so our family made a deal. Safe boundaries for you, guaranteed guardianship from us." The horned man nodded slowly, his antlers catching the light from the broken windows. "The compact was made in good faith by both sides. Your ancestor understood that we were not invaders, but refugees, seeking only a place to exist without conflict." A soft whimper came from the kitchen as Sarah began to regain consciousness. I wanted to check on her, but the horned man's presence demanded my complete attention. This negotiation would determine whether she lived or died, whether the entities remained contained or spread into the wider world. "The boundaries have held for over a century," the horned man continued. "But change is inevitable. New circumstances require new agreements." "What kind of new circumstances?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Your neighbor's presence has created opportunities that did not exist before." The horned man gestured toward the carved symbols on Sarah's walls. "Her ignorance allowed my companions to claim territory beyond the original boundaries. This cannot be undone, but it can be properly managed." Behind me, I heard Sarah pushing herself into a sitting position, her breathing sharp and panicked. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse and shaky. "What's happening? Where am I?" I turned to see her leaning against the kitchen doorway, blood still trickling from the cut on her temple. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there too, a new awareness that hadn't been there before. Whatever they'd done to her had left her with knowledge she hadn't had yesterday. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to listen to what we're about to discuss. Your life depends on understanding what's being offered here." She looked past me at the three supernatural beings standing in her destroyed living room, and instead of screaming or running, she just nodded. The change in her reaction told me that part of the forced compliance had involved explaining exactly what she was dealing with. "The young woman has seen the true nature of our kind," the horned man said. "She understands the stakes involved in this negotiation." "I understand that I'm trapped," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, "and that my choices are accept whatever deal you're offering, or face something worse than what happened last night." The horned man's amber eyes looked at her with what might have been approval. "Being clear is the foundation of any lasting agreement. You have indeed seen what fighting back brings." I stepped between Sarah and the other creatures, though I knew it was mostly for show. If the horned man wanted to hurt either of us, there wasn't much I could do to stop him. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "Extension of the original compact to include both properties," the horned man replied. "The young woman accepts the same responsibilities that have protected your family for generations. In exchange, she receives the same protections." Sarah pushed herself to her feet, using the doorway for support. "What responsibilities? What protections?" I turned to face her, knowing that this explanation might be the most important conversation of both our lives. 6 rules that my family has followed for over a century. Rules that keep both sides safe from each other. "I'll follow them," Sarah said immediately. "Whatever they are, I'll follow them." The man in the suit finally spoke up, his earlier politeness now edged with frustration. The compact was specific to the Thompson bloodline. Extension to outsiders sets dangerous precedents. "Precedents evolve with circumstances," the horned man replied without looking at him. The alternative is breakdown of containment and conflict that serves no one's interests. The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees, and more frost spread across the walls. I realized this was how the horned man displayed authority. Not through threats or violence, but through demonstrations of power that reminded everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. The rules will need modification to cover both properties, I said, thinking through how to adapt traditions that had been designed for a single household. But the core principles remained the same. Sarah stepped closer to me, and I could see her hands shaking as she tried to appear calm. Tell me what I need to do. I looked at each of the supernatural beings in turn, then back at Sarah. First rule: neither of us leaves our properties after sunset. Second rule: we both ignore the knocking woman, no matter how loud or persistent she gets. Third rule: the barn on my property stays off limits to you, just like it was to me until today. Fourth rule, I continued: if the man in a suit appears on either property, we ask him to leave immediately. No conversation, no negotiation, just a firm request that he go. The man in the suit's jaw tightened, but he didn't object. The horned man's presence made arguments impossible. Fifth rule expands to cover the forest between our properties. We don't take anything from those woods. We don't enter them unless absolutely necessary, and we respect that they belong to others. Sarah nodded, and I could see her mentally cataloging each restriction. Her earlier dismissal of my warnings had been replaced by complete acceptance of whatever was necessary to survive. Sixth rule, I said: if either of us gets lost or finds ourselves in a situation where the supernatural world intrudes directly into our lives, we stop moving and wait for guidance. The horned man stepped forward, his massive presence filling the small room. These terms are acceptable to all parties involved. Sarah looked at me, then at each of the entities. I accept. And the Thompson guardianship extends to include protection of both properties under the modified compact, I said. The knocking woman moved for the first time since the horned man had arrived, reaching into a fold of her dress that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. She withdrew something that looked like a piece of bark covered in symbols similar to those carved into Sarah's walls. The agreement must be marked, the horned man said. I watched as the knocking woman approached Sarah with the bark fragment. Sarah held perfectly still as the woman pressed it against the cut on her temple, and when she pulled it away, new symbols had appeared in the dried blood. The marking binds you to the compact, the horned man explained. Break the rules, and the protection ends immediately. Sarah nodded, touching the symbols on her temple carefully. I understand. The sound of a truck engine rumbling up the driveway interrupted the moment. Dad had returned from town, and I realized he was about to walk into a situation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about keeping the boundaries between worlds. The man in the suit and the knocking woman began backing towards Sarah's front door, their movements once again taking on that mechanical precision. As they reached the doorway, they both looked back at the horned man with expressions that might have been disappointment. The original boundaries are restored, the horned man said to them. Expansion attempts will cease until the next formal review. And when will that be? The man in the suit asked. When circumstances again require renegotiation. The horned man's tone suggested that could be years or decades from now. Until then, the compact holds. Both things disappeared through the doorway so quickly it was like watching them step backward into fog. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving only slightly warmer air and the gradual melting of frost on the windows. Dad's truck door slammed outside, followed by the sound of his work boots on Sarah's front porch. When he appeared in the doorway, his eyes immediately found the horned man, and his entire body language changed into something I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition of authority so complete that resistance wasn't even considered. Robert Thompson, the horned man said by way of greeting. "Sir," Dad replied, inclining his head slightly. "I wasn't aware that formal intervention had become necessary. Your son has proven capable of adapting the compact to changing circumstances," the horned man said. "The boundaries are secure, though they now encompass additional territory." Dad's eyes moved from the horned man to me, then to Sarah, taking in her injured condition and the symbols marked in blood on her temple. His jaw worked silently for several seconds before he spoke. "The boy broke the rules to get here. The boy broke outdated interpretations to preserve the larger purpose," the horned man corrected. "Guardianship requires wisdom, not blind adherence to tradition." I expected Dad to argue, to assert his authority as the senior guardian, or to challenge my right to make decisions that affected our family's century-long responsibility. Instead, he just looked around at the destruction in Sarah's house, at the carved symbols on the walls, at the clear evidence that the old boundaries had failed. "The compact extends to both properties now?" he asked. "With modifications appropriate to the expanded scope," the horned man confirmed. "Your son negotiated terms that preserve containment while acknowledging new realities." Dad nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the implications. More territory to monitor, more responsibility to maintain, but also a solution that prevented the total breakdown of supernatural containment. "The young woman understands her obligations?" "I do," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite the exhaustion visible in her posture. "I'll follow the rules exactly as they've been explained to me." The horned man moved toward the front door, his massive frame somehow navigating the debris-filled room without disturbing anything. As he reached the threshold, he turned back to address all three of us. "The compact has evolved, but its core purpose remains unchanged. Both sides benefit from maintained boundaries and mutual respect. Honor this, and the protection continues. Violate it, and the consequences will extend far beyond these properties." He stepped through the doorway and simply vanished, leaving behind only the gradual warming of the air and the fading glow from where his antlers had caught the afternoon light. Dad, Sarah, and I stood in the sudden silence, surrounded by the wreckage of her house and the weight of responsibilities that had just expanded beyond anything our family had managed before. "We'll need to help her clean up," Dad said finally, "and make sure she understands exactly what each rule means in practice." I looked at Sarah, who was still touching the symbols on her temple with careful fingers. "Are you okay with this? Really okay with it?" She managed a weak smile that didn't entirely hide her fear. "I don't think okay is the right word, but I'm alive. I understand what I'm dealing with, and I have neighbors who know how to keep me safe." She paused, looking around at her destroyed living room. "That's more than I had this morning." Dad picked up an overturned chair and set it back on its legs, a simple gesture that somehow marked the beginning of our new reality. The Thompson family guardianship had expanded to include Sarah's property. The rules had been changed to cover circumstances none of our ancestors had faced, and I'd learned that being a guardian meant adapting traditions when the world changed around them. The responsibility my family carried was bigger than I'd ever imagined, but it was also more flexible than I'd been taught to believe. The horned man was right. Wisdom mattered more than blind following of tradition. The rules weren't commandments carved in stone. They were a living agreement that could change when change served the bigger purpose of keeping both worlds safe from each other.